What's up guys, I'm Josh in Lift Things, and I'm here to talk about sumo versus conventional deadlift, settling the debate. Too long didn't watch, neither is easier or harder, sumo wasn't cheating, and the stance that you feel more comfortable with is largely going to be set up by your anatomy. FYI, a lot of this information is just going to be floated from Greg Nuckols' Stronger by Science article. Highly recommend the website, it'll be linked in the description, go check them out. So first off, let me just show you some clips of the sumo versus conventional so you get a good idea of what I'm talking about. Now obviously sumo's going to have a much wider leg stance and the toes are typically pointed more out. As you can see, the hands are directly beneath the shoulders, it's exactly what you want. And in that starting position, the hips are going very low, almost parallel, and the hips are kind of further away from the bar than they would be in a conventional stance. You can see versus conventional, his upper body is very upright. His back is virtually straight up throughout the entirety of the lift. And now if we move on to a more conventional stance, you can see that his feet are much closer together. The toes are typically pointed forward. The arms go a little bit outside the shoulders, typically because you have to make room for your knees. If we look here from the side, we can see that his hips are not anywhere near as low. He's nowhere near parallel. And you can see that the back angle is much more diagonal. And those are going to be the prime differences. Some powerlifter is going to fucking leave a comment about some intricacy that I did not discuss. I do not care. Now, the sumo variation is going to bring a whole lot more quad and adductor activation to the movement. So some people think that it's cheating for that reason, but I'll touch on that. Now, the lockout or the final position in the deadlift for both of these is roughly when the hand's going to be mid-thigh. Obviously, that depends on how long your arms are. But for the most part, your arms are going to be at mid-thigh at the end of the lift. This will come up later, so it's important to recognize. The conventional is typically easier off the ground, but then harder at the lockout. This makes sense. With a far more diagonal back angle, you have to use a whole lot more of back muscles in order to keep the spine stable and leveled throughout the entire lift, right? Now, sumo, on the other hand, is kind of the inverse. The lockout's much easier. Remember, your back is already very upright, but off the ground, it's a little bit harder. And that's even with the stance bringing in much more quad and thigh adductor activation. I think most people would agree that sumo is a far more technical lift, but that doesn't really matter right now. Now, some people refer to the sumo deadlift as cheating. Play the Chris Bumstead clip. And these people are wrong. One of the biggest reasons that people say that sumo is cheating is due to the ROM. They say that sumo has a much lower ROM, and this is true. Advocates for the sumo deadlift will say that since both lifts end with the hand at mid-thigh during lockout, that there is no ROM difference. But that's kind of forgetting the fact that with wider legs, your mid-thigh is lower to the ground. This shortens the ROM a lot. In fact, from this study, a three-dimensional biomechanical analysis of sumo and conventional deadlift styles by Escamilla and some other people, vertical bar distance, mechanical work, and predicted energy expenditure were approximately 25 to 40% greater in the conventional group. Now, I don't think you need a study to tell you that the ROM is significantly lesser. It kind of just makes sense, right? The question is that difference of ROM actually all that useful or effective? And the answer is probably not. From the Stronger by Science article, however, the difference in range of motion doesn't really matter. Yes, it does mean that a conventional deadlifter needs to do 20 to 25% more mechanical work to complete a lift, but most maximal deadlifts take 5 seconds or less to complete. Even the grindiest deadlift is usually locked out within 10 seconds. Your muscles have enough stored ATP and phosphocreatine to ensure that maximal output lasting shorter than 8 to 10 seconds won't be limited by energy production. The difference in mechanical work would likely make a difference in a deadlift for reps challenge, but not when talking about a 1 rep max attempt. The second point is, it's important to keep in mind that you don't miss a lift because you were too weak through the entire range of motion. You miss a lift because you were too weak through your very weakest part of the movement. In other words, the critical range of motion that determines whether you make or miss a lift is similarly tiny for a lift with a long range of motion and a lift with a short range of motion. This makes complete sense. Think about any actual time that you failed a rep before. It wasn't the entire movement that you had issue with. It was typically some type of sticking point. For instance, on the bench press, on the transition from your elbows being at 45 degrees to full extension, or on the squat, the same thing on the way up. So the difference in ROM is actually not that important at the end of the day. Another commonly brought up reason why sumo is cheating, is, at least by people that took Physics 101, is that they think that the hip torque demands are lessened in the deadlift, at least the sumo deadlift, because the hips are closer to the bar. And at least from the side, the hips do appear to be much further away from the bar. I mean, just look at this image here. We have the hips very far back on conventional, and then here in sumo, they are much closer to the bar. And they kind of roast some people here. Now, this is an idea that makes intuitive sense if you combine Physics 101 with Biomechanics 101. Hip extension is classically defined as a movement in the sagittal front to back plane, and torque is equal to moment arm multiplied by the load applied. So with a sumo deadlift, since the hip moment arm, the horizontal distance between your hips and the bar, is shorter, it requires less hip extension torque to lift the weight, right? No. Hip extension occurs in 3 dimensions. When the hips are externally rotated, that means hip extension occurs in both the sagittal, front to back, and the frontal, left to right planes. Not only is hip extension torque being considered, talking about the hips to the bar distance, it's also the femur length, which is much, much wider in a sumo than it is versus a conventional. Here's a pretty good way to illustrate it. Shout out MS Paint, that's what it looks like. So what does all this stupid nerd math mean? It means that hip extension demands are nearly identical between the conventional and the sumo lifts. And this was even found to be true in this same exact study that was referenced earlier. So once again, no. The sumo is not any easier to perform because of its setup, because of its range of motion, because of its hip torque demands, or anything like that. Now, some people even say that the sumo deadlift is kind of cheating, at least when you're trying to train deadlifts, because it takes out a whole lot of the hamstring or the glutes, replaces it with the quads and the adductors, but that's just not the case. Escamilla, again, coming in with the hitter, an electromyographic analysis of sumo and conventional style deadlifts. What they basically find is that knee flexion is much more increased in the sumo deadlift because, of course it is, quads are much more activated, but that the hamstrings and glutes have nearly the same level of activation as a conventional style deadlift. It makes sense. Good luck pulling anything off the floor without using your hamstrings and your glutes. This is a side tangent that I didn't put in the script, but people love all the time to focus on these little bits of activation of their weird curl variations for short head or long head or yada yada yada. The body is a system, and the system cannot act individually. Oftentimes, when you do something, everything will be activated. So stop worrying about the short head of the bicep. Stop worrying about the lower chest. Stop worrying about back width versus back thickness by horizontal or vertical rows. All that shit is just a meme, and just stop, please. So if the ROM isn't beneficial, if the hip torque demands are similar, if you use all the same muscles except the quads and the adductors, why would someone want to use sumo in the first place? I mean, hell, the only thing you gain, apparently, is just the risk to get lambasted by people online for cheating. Even though, of course, every single powerlifting federation allows sumo, so in what world could it be cheating? Well, the same reason you would want to do the sumo is the same reason that some people prefer very wide stance toes out squats or narrow and toes forward squats. It all has to do with your anatomy, specifically how your femur fits into your hip socket. From this image here, we can see 3 pretty classic hip structures, though of course there's variations throughout all of these. But what you have to worry about is the angle at which your femur meets in to your pelvis. It can be very, very parallel with a complete 90-degree stint. It can be very, very open, or just somewhere in between. Now, depending on what your general hip structure is like, is going to decide where you feel most comfortable and most strong in pulling off the ground or squatting. So again, from the Stronger by Science article, image 1 shows what a normal angled inclination looks like. This is the typical human, the perfect bastard. Image 2 shows a coxa vera hip with a 90-degree bend there. And image 3 shows a coxa valga hips. The person 2 with the coxa vera hip will almost certainly need to deadlift conventional, especially if they have deep hip sockets, which is another variable to throw into play. And they'll probably squat with a pretty narrow stance as well. With too much hip abduction, the top of the femur will be encroaching upon the pelvis itself. This person 3 with the coxa valga, will have very little problems doing splits and maybe better pulling sumo. With more hip abduction, they may be able to get more tension on their adductors, specifically the magnus. Now, I have read this series here by Dean Somerset. It is awesome. They will be linked in the description. I highly recommend checking it out if you're a nerd and this stuff really interests you. Something this article doesn't touch on, though, is that there's even more body variation to what you'll feel more comfortable with. If you have longer arms and a longer torso and shorter legs, or any variation between all of those things, you're going to feel more comfortable using a different type of pulling style. So people are probably asking, well, why does every powerlifter pull sumo then? And that's just a misnomer. It's not true. Not every powerlifter pulls sumo. At the elite level, the bigger you are, probably the taller you are, probably the longer your arms are, will probably lead to you pulling conventional easier than sumo. Do you think that these elite lifters are just giving up the easier and cheating method just for some type of, like, morality? No, some people feel better with certain forms, and that's about it. The difference between most conventional pullers sumo pull and most sumo pullers conventional pull is very similar. And it makes complete sense. These people are just great at pulling in the first place, but their anatomy lends itself to one style of pull. So hopefully now you realize that the sumo deadlift is not cheating. I mean, it's kind of fucking common sense to anyone that isn't just trying to get rage bait clicks. So how should you decide if you want to pull conventional or sumo? Try them both out. I typically recommend everyone starts with conventional, at least for a few months, and then eventually you can try peppering in some sumo and see what you like. They really help show where your weaknesses are. If your sumo is far higher than your conventional, then you probably have a weak back. And if your conventional is way higher than your sumo, you probably have weak legs. Do what you want to do. But I will say this once again, that sumo is a far more technical lift. You can cheat pull with conventional a fuckload of weight, while if you have a little bit of a mess up with sumo, the rep seems to fail. That's just anecdotal, there's been no studies on this, but talk to anyone in the scene and they'll probably agree. So no, it is not cheating. By the way, C-Bum, you'll never look like Frank Zane. And guys, that's the video. Am I an idiot? Did I forget something? Leave a comment down below and let me know. It really helps out the channel and I respond to every single one. If you like this style of content, you can follow all these socials and join the Discord. The links are in the description. I post exercise content twice a day, every single day. If you've made it this far, you should hit the like button and you should subscribe. You kinda owe me. And as always, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.